Picture this, a night where the sea itself turns traitor, where screams vanish beneath crashing waves, and where the shadow of Blackbeard looms, not as a man, but as a curse carved into the wind. Tonight, this isn't just another pirate story. It's a confession sealed in fear, a memory buried beneath salt and sorrow. On board the doomed Spanish galleon La Estrella, betrayal spilled faster than blood. A captain shot, a woman left to the mercy of the storm, and in the distance, the dark outline of the Queen Anne's revenge, slicing through lightning like a ghost that never left these waters. Some say it was fate, others say it was vengeance. But those who sailed that night never forgot what followed. Legends aren't just told, they're passed from sailor to sailor. If you crave the untold tales of the sea, loyalty, loss, and vengeance, subscribe to the channel and claim your place in our crew. When Isadora's eyes finally opened, it felt like the sea had chewed her up and spat her onto the floor of some forgotten nightmare. Her throat burned with salt, every breath scraping her lungs like broken glass. Her skin raw, blistered, her clothes stiff like dried parchment against open wounds. Somewhere close, the slow drag of metal against stone broke the silence, steady, patient, like a ritual done 1,000 times before. Lantern light barely touched the corners of the small cabin. The air smelled of wet wood, old rum and iron. And there, seated at a crooked table surrounded by maps, curled from years of salt and heat, was Blackbeard, Edward Teach, the shadow that haunted every sailor's worst story. His head was low, focused on the blade he dragged across the whetstone, the rasp of steel filling the room like a warning. His beard, thick and dark, hung like a tangled curse. Strands of half-burned slow matches twisted through it, faint smoke still curling, as if the man couldn't decide whether he belonged among the living or something else entirely. "You're alive," he said, without looking up, his voice slow, cracked, like gravel buried under years of regret. For now. Isadora's lips barely moved. "Where?" The word came out more breath than sound. "Off Tortuga," he answered, still not bothering to meet her eyes. "My ship." Her heart lurched. Memories of the storm came rushing back, splintered decks, cold water swallowing her screams, the crack of musket fire, Ruiz, her husband, falling, never moving again. "Why?" she forced out. Not sure if she wanted the answer. Blackbeard paused, tilting the blade just enough for the lantern to catch its edge. For a breath, the steel glowed like something alive. "You were floating like driftwood," he said, finally glancing at her. His eyes were empty but knowing, the kind of look a man gives when he's seen too many faces disappear. "Figured I'd let the sea claim one less soul tonight." Her hands moved on instinct, covering her belly. The child, still there, still moving. A faint kick under her palm, like a whisper, from below, reminding her that breathing, even this kind of breathing, still mattered. Blackbeard stood slow as the tide, setting the cutlass down with a soft thud that sounded heavier than it should have. He crossed the room, boots creaking on warped planks, and leaned close enough for her to smell the rum on his breath and the sea in his skin. "Rest while you can," he said. "Storms past, but worse things than weather still wait for us out there." And with that, he left her alone, with nothing but the sound of the hull groaning beneath her, and the weight of her own unfinished story pressing down on her chest like the sea, never truly letting go. The days dragged on, heavy, like wet canvas refusing to dry. Every breath tasted of salt and rust. Every corner of the Queen Anne's revenge carried the weight of unspoken threats. Blackbeard didn't need words to command the ship. His silence filled the air thicker than gunpowder smoke. Orders were given with a tilt of the head, a glance, the tightening of his jaw, and when he did speak, voices dropped, hands froze, even the waves seemed to pause. Isadora learned fast. Keep your head down, move when told, eat whatever the cook threw her way, no matter how sour or stale. Her body mended slower than she liked, wounds tightening, bruises fading, but inside nothing healed. The storm still lived inside her ribs, Ruiz's last breath still echoing in the back of her mind. Nights were the worst. Laughter from the crew below deck turned to shouting, then back to silence, the kind that made her skin crawl. Sleep came in fragments, broken and restless. Each time her eyes closed, the sea pulled her back to that night. The waves, the cold, and Blackbeard's shadow standing at the edge of it all, watching like he always had been. Then one night, as the moon slipped behind thick clouds, she found herself near the helm, alone. The crew was below, drinking Tortuga rum like they were trying to forget their own names. The deck felt strangely still, as if the ship herself was holding her breath. She didn't hear him approach. Blackbeard never made noise when he didn't want to. When she turned, he was there. Close. Too close. In one hand, a tin mug, the liquid inside dark and steaming. "Willow bark and rum," he said, his voice low, almost tired. "For the fever." Isadora hesitated, her throat already dry, her stomach twisted from days of half meals and bad dreams. But still, she took it. The taste bit hard, sharp and bitter, burning all the way down. But when the heat settled, her mind felt clearer, sharper, like waking from underwater. That's when she saw it. Not in his words, but in his face. Behind the scars, the smoke, the cold calculation, there it was. Grief. Old. Buried. But there, carved into every line near his eyes, sitting heavy on his shoulders like an anchor he never cut loose. A man surrounded by death, but haunted by something far worse. The kind of ghosts that don't drift away with the tide. The kind that stay. The calm never lasted long aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge. Peace was just the space between storms, and this time the clouds were coming fast. Word traveled like sickness through the ports. Whispers reached Tortuga, then the smaller coves, then Blackbeard himself. A Spanish bounty ship, La Justiciera, had dropped anchor near the outer reefs. A vessel known for finishing what others left undone. Their target wasn't gold or cargo. It was her, Isadora. The same men who had gunned down Ruiz, left her bleeding on splintered decks, and vanished without a second glance were now hunting again. This time they wanted to erase what little breath she had left. Blackbeard heard it first. One of his spies, a boy with eyes too old for his face, came slipping through the lower deck shadows, bringing the news like it was poison wrapped in cloth. Isadora had been below, mending torn sails with trembling fingers, trying to forget the weight pressing against her ribs night after night. She barely noticed when Blackbeard's boots hit the planks above her until his voice cut through the air like a blade. "Tell me everything about them." Not a question, a command, the kind you didn't argue with. Her hands froze over the needle and thread. For a heartbeat, she thought of lying, of staying silent. But when she looked up and met his gaze, there was no room for hesitation. So she spoke. She told him about Captain Morales, the cold in his voice, the violence always waiting in. His eyes, the way he smiled just before giving the kind of orders men didn't come back from. She described every face she could remember. The night they turned, the moment they let Ruiz fall. The air around Blackbeard shifted as she spoke. The shadows near him seemed to thicken, as if the ship itself understood what was coming. When she finished, the room stayed quiet, but only for a second. Blackbeard's fingers curled into fists, slow, deliberate, like he was holding back something heavier than rage. "Then let them come," he said, barely above a whisper. His tone wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "But they won't leave." Before the first light of dawn broke the horizon, Blackbeard made his move. The Queen Anne's Revenge slipped through the dark waters like a shadow with teeth, its hull cutting toward a place most sailors refused to name aloud: Dead Man's Bay. A narrow cove, hidden by jagged cliffs and littered with submerged rocks, sharp enough to tear the belly out of any ship too bold or too blind to navigate its throat. The perfect place for an ambush or a grave, depending on who told the story. The crew moved with grim purpose. Flintlocks were cleaned and loaded, cutlasses sharpened to a shine that caught the pale moonlight. Nets were stretched across shallow inlets, traps buried just beneath the sand, where Spanish boots might sink too deep to pull free. Blackbeard stood at the helm, his face unreadable, eyes scanning the horizon like he could already smell the gunpowder that hadn't yet burned. His voice rolled across the deck, low and steady, barking orders with the weight of every fight he'd survived. Isadora watched from the shadows, her body heavier now, the child inside her shifting with every step, every lurch of the ship. Blackbeard had given her one thing that morning, a single flintlock pistol and strict instructions. "Below deck," he had said, "no exceptions." But when the first cannon cracked the air, shaking the floor beneath her, sending dust and splinters raining from the ceiling beams, something inside her broke loose. Fear, yes, but also something sharper, something that wouldn't let her sit and wait to be forgotten. Crawling toward the gun deck, each movement dragging fire through her ribs, she pulled herself up just in time to see him, Blackbeard, standing among the smoke and chaos. His coat already dusted with powder, his hair wild, shouting over the roar of cannon fire like a man commanding the sea itself. "You should be below," he roared, catching her by the arm with a grip that left bruises without meaning to. "And let them burn me alive," she spat back, voice raw but steady, eyes locked on his. For a single breath, the world around them disappeared. No cannon, no screaming crew, no splintered rails or crashing waves, just two people standing between survival and the grave, neither willing to back down. Blackbeard's expression darkened, but something flickered in his gaze. Not approval, not yet, but recognition. The kind of look a man gives when he realizes someone else knows how it feels to fight with nothing left but will. Without another word, he shoved a powder horn into her hands, the metal cold, rough from use. "Then stay close," he growled, "and load fast." The air turned thick, too thick to breathe without tasting ash and iron. Smoke curled in heavy waves across the deck, wrapping around the rigging like a living thing. The crack of musket fire never stopped, mingling with the screams of men too stubborn or too foolish to die quickly. For hours the battle dragged on. The Spanish ship, La Justiciera, burned slow and angry near the reef, her hull split open by the rocks beneath Dead Man's Bay. But even sinking, she fought back. Before her decks were swallowed by flame, a boarding party had scrambled over the side, spilling onto the Queen Anne's Revenge like venom through an open wound. Blades met flesh, flintlocks fired at shadows, men wrestled across the blood-slicked planks, faces twisted in fear, rage, and something worse, desperation. Isadora should have stayed below, she knew that. But when the chaos spilled toward the lower deck, when a Spanish sailor lunged from the smoke with a cutlass raised high, instinct took hold. Her hands moved faster than her fear. The flintlock kicked hard against her palm, and the man, the one who had looked at her with nothing but hate, collapsed at her feet, a hole torn through his chest. For one long second she stood, frozen. The smell of gunpowder burned her throat, her ears rang, but her legs, they stayed firm beneath her. Somewhere beyond the haze, Blackbeard fought like a man carved from fury itself. His beard smoked at the edges, lit fuses tangled through it, giving him the look of something not quite alive, not quite human. His coat flared with every movement, his cutlass flashing like a signal to every soul foolish enough to face him. By the time the last of Morales's men fell, the deck was littered with the wreckage of the fight. Splintered wood, spent shot, bodies that would never rise again. And there, pinned against the mast, cornered, bleeding from a deep gash along his side, stood Captain Morales. Blackbeard approached, slow, measured, dragging his blade behind him like he wanted Morales to hear every inch of steel scraping the deck. The Spanish captain lifted his hands, voice broken, begging words spilling out in half-choked gasps. Promises of surrender, bargains no one would ever honor. Isadora stood behind Blackbeard, one arm tight around her belly, the other trembling but still raised, the empty pistol hanging loose at her side. Her voice was barely more than breath, but it cut through the air like a final nail in a coffin. "No mercy," she whispered. Blackbeard didn't blink, didn't pause, didn't grant it. The battle was over, but the storm wasn't. Not for her. While the crew filled the night with drunken shouts and half-mad laughter, toasting their survival with sour rum and stained hands, Isadora's body gave way to something deeper, more relentless than any cannon or blade. Pain, sharp and sudden, twisted through her without mercy. She barely made it to the lower deck before her knees buckled, collapsing onto the cold, blood-slick planks. Her breath came in ragged bursts, sweat pooling along her hairline, her fingers clawing at the wood like she could anchor herself against what was coming. The child. Her time had come, and there was no stopping it. Somewhere above, Blackbeard stood with the last embers of battle still burning across his skin. Powder smoke clung to his coat, dried blood marked the edge of his sleeve, but when he heard the shouts, saw the crew scatter from the hatch like rats fleeing a sinking hold, he knew. Within moments he was there, boots pounding down the steps, voice cutting through the air like a blade sharpened on fear. Without a word he lifted her from the deck, her weight barely more than the anchor of her own. And pain. He carried her to his quarters, a place no one entered without invitation, not even his officers. Hot water, linens, now. His voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. The threat in it was enough to sober every drunk fool still standing. The crew moved fast, clumsy but obedient, driven less by concern and more by the fear of what would happen if they didn't. Inside the captain's cabin, the air turned thick with heat and sweat. Lanterns swung from the beams, throwing restless shadows across the walls. The table, usually covered in maps and sealed letters, became a makeshift cradle for her struggle. Through blood, through screams that scraped her throat raw, Isadora fought harder than she ever had before. And through it all, Blackbeard stayed. His scarred hands, built for war, for breaking bone, for wielding death, found a different rhythm that night. Steady, unshaking, guiding, holding. He knelt beside her, spoke low words that didn't sound like him, soft enough to steady her, breathing, firm enough to pull her back each time the pain dragged her under. When the first cry broke through the air, sharp, defiant, it cut through the noise of the ship like a flare in a starless night. The crew fell silent above. Every voice, every footstep, every drunken song vanished in an instant. Blackbeard lifted the tiny, trembling form, holding the boy in his massive, battle-worn hands like he'd never held anything so fragile before. "It's a boy," he said, his voice low, rough, but softer than she ever thought she'd hear from him. For the first time in days, the ship, the sea, even the ghosts seemed to pause. They named him Mateo. The name came to Isadora in a half-dream, somewhere between exhaustion and the soft, shallow breaths of the newborn curled against her chest, a name that sounded like hope, like something still untouched by salt and sorrow. For a while, the ship seemed to drift in a strange quiet. The crew kept their distance, their loud songs replaced by nervous glances whenever they passed Blackbeard's cabin door. Superstition ran deep among pirates, and the arrival of a child, born in the belly of battle, under the roof of the captain himself, felt like an omen no one dared speak aloud. But Blackbeard, he changed. In the days that followed, he withdrew, pulled further into himself like a man wrestling something too heavy to name. The laughter that once shook his chest, the rage that used to burn behind his eyes, Both faded into a slow, cold silence. Isadora watched him from afar, smoking alone near the helm, staring out at the sea like it had taken something from him and never given it back. One night, with the moon painting the deck in pale silver, she found him seated near the prow, elbows on his knees, pipe forgotten in his hand, the ember long dead. His eyes stayed fixed on the waves, dark, endless, shifting like a mouth that never stopped whispering. For a long time she said nothing. Then, as the cold night air wrapped around, her and the baby stirred against her skin, she stepped closer, cradling Matteo tighter, feeling the fragile weight of him still so new to the world. "My wife died giving birth," Blackbeard said suddenly, his voice barely more than a crack in the night. He didn't turn, didn't blink. "My boy too, long before this life took me." The words hung there, drifting, heavier than the ocean air. Isadora's throat tightened, but she didn't step back. She stood beside him, letting the silence settle between them like another ghost. Neither of them had the strength to chase away. "You saved us both," she whispered, voice trembling but true. For the first time, Blackbeard looked at her, and when he spoke, there was no anger, no pride, only something hollow, cracked open and left unfinished. "I didn't save you," he said, low, broken, like he was speaking to the sea more than to her. "I just refused to lose another family to the water." Weeks drifted by, slow and heavy, like the tide pulling at a ship's anchor but never strong enough to drag it free. The Queen Anne's Revenge stayed moored off Tortuga, its sails furled, its cannons quiet, but the air on board never softened. Not really. Word from the mainland came with every passing ship, every drunk sailor too loose with his tongue. More Spanish bounty hunters, more warships leaving Cartagena, their mission simple and cold: hunt down the widow of Captain Ruiz and crush anyone reckless enough to shelter her. The crew heard the rumors. They sharpened their blades with tighter grips, loaded their flintlocks with hands that shook just a little more at night. The sea, always hungry, felt closer now. One evening, as the sun sank low, bleeding its last light across the waves, Blackbeard stood outside Isadora's cabin. The air smelled of salt and gunpowder, like it always did, just before something broke loose. He didn't knock, just stood there, arms crossed, staring at the door like he was fighting with himself. When she opened it, Matteo nestled asleep against her chest. He spoke without ceremony. "You could go ashore," he said, voice rough as weathered rope. "Disappear. Find some quiet village, some place where the sea can't find you. Raise the boy far from all this." For a long breath, she stayed silent. The offer hung there between them, heavy and tempting, like a rope ladder dangling above a burning ship. But then she shook her head, slow, certain. "You know I can't," she said softly, but with iron in her throat. "They'll follow me. They'll never stop." Blackbeard's gaze held hers, and in that look she saw it all: the years, the battles, the losses that had stacked like stones on his back, the faces he couldn't save, the choices that never left him. "Then stay," he said, voice low, final. "But know this." He stepped closer, the deck creaking under his boots, the shadows of the setting sun curling over his shoulders, like the ghosts that followed him everywhere. "If you do, you're not a passenger on this ship." He let the words settle like dust on a coffin lid. "Your crew, and crew fights." Isadora didn't flinch, didn't look away. Her fingers curled tighter around Matteo, and with her next breath she answered the only way she knew how. "Then let them come." At dawn, the sea held its breath. Blackbeard stood high atop the quarterdeck, his silhouette carved sharp against the first pale streaks of morning. The rising sun spilled gold and rust across the water, but none of it touched him. He, remained a dark figure against the light, unmoving, like a statue built from salt, iron, and old regret. Below, near the mainmast, Isadora stood with Matteo held close to her chest. The boy, still small, still fragile, but alive. Her hands trembled only slightly now, more from the chill of the morning air than from fear. A single pistol rested at her waist, worn, loaded, ready. Not a symbol of hope, but of choice. Around them, the crew moved like men waking from a long nightmare. Faces smeared with powder, voices hoarse from battle cries and rum-soaked songs, but alive, all of them, at least for now. They hoisted the sails with slow, deliberate hands, like each knot and line was a vow they weren't willing to break. And then the flag rose. The black flag. The one every sailor in the Caribbean knew, even if they never dared speak its name aloud. The cloth whipped high into the morning wind, its dark threads twisting like serpents, dancing above the masts as if taunting the horizon. Itself, the skull, the hourglass, the spears piercing heart and soul, a promise written in symbols only the sea could fully understand. There would be no peace, no sanctuary waiting beyond the next cove. The life ahead of them would be carved from salt, blood, and choices too heavy for most hearts to carry. But beneath that flag, beneath Blackbeard's shadow, one thing was certain: they would never face the next storm alone again. Still, even as the ship pulled away from Dead Man's Bay, as Tortuga disappeared behind them and the open sea stretched wide, the ghosts remained. Blackbeard, standing near the helm, smoked in silence, eyes fixed on something far beyond the horizon. Not land, not ships, but memories, the kind that crawl back when the wind dies and the water turns still. Isadora watched him and knew. No matter how far they sailed, some shadows never stayed behind. Some losses never loosened their grip. Her child's heartbeat pressed against her chest, a reminder of what she had saved and what she had left behind. For every victory there had been a betrayal, for every life spared a promise broken, and for every face still standing there were others the sea had swallowed, names already fading, stories left half told. Some scars never fade, some debts the sea never lets you forget. And as the Queen Anne's revenge cut through the waves, faster and bolder with each gust, the questions burned quiet but constant in every heart on board. How long before the next fight? How many more ghosts would follow? And when the time came, would they still be ready? Did you already know this forgotten part of the story? And if you had been on that ship, what would you have done? What other sea stories deserve to be told here? If this story touched you in any way, don't let it vanish, like so many other names the sea has taken. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep hearing what was never meant to be forgotten.